There's a moment that comes up again and again when you spend time with all in the family. And it's not loud at first. It doesn't announce itself as something important. But if you pay attention, if you sit with it for a while, you start to notice that it's quietly driving everything, shaping the way the characters talk to each other, shaping the way the room feels, shaping the rhythm of the entire episode. And that moment is when Archie Bunker assumes that being the loudest voice in the room, or the oldest, or the one who has seen more, automatically makes him the one who deserves respect, and more than that, the one who shouldn't be questioned. And there's one kind of episode where that idea isn't just present, it's the whole foundation, where everything that happens circles back to this tension between authority and respect, and how easily those two things get confused. You can picture it unfolding in that familiar living room, the one that feels almost like a stage even though it's meant to be a home. Because everything important seems to happen there, every disagreement, every moment of connection, every uncomfortable silence. And Archie is already in his chair, not just sitting, but settled in a way that suggests this is his space, his ground, the place where his voice carries weight. Moves around with that gentle awareness she always has, not trying to control anything, but quietly holding things together in a way that doesn't draw attention to itself. And Gloria is nearby, already tuned into the emotional undercurrents, already sensing that something is going to shift, because it usually does. Mike is there too, and there's something about his presence that feels like a challenge even before he says anything, not because he's trying to provoke, but because he represents a different way of thinking, a different way of engaging, one that doesn't automatically accept authority just because it's presented that way. And it begins, as it often does, with something small. The comment and opinions. Something Archie says with complete confidence, not asking for agreement, not opening a conversation, just stating it as if it's already settled, as if the room should accept it and move on. But Mike doesn't move on. Oh, he questions it. Not aggressively, not disrespectfully, but clearly, and that's enough to change everything. Because for Archie, that question isn't just about the topic. It's about something deeper, something tied to how he sees himself in that room, how he understands his role. And when Mike pushes back, even slightly, it feels like a challenge to that role. And that's where the tension begins to build. Not in shouting, not in dramatic confrontation, but in that subtle shift where Archie starts to lean into his position more firmly, where his responses become less about the topic and more about asserting his place, his authority, his right to be the one who speaks and is accepted without question. He repeats himself. He reinforces his points. He leans on his experience, his age, his perspective, all the things that, in his mind, should command respect. But what's fascinating is how the show slowly reveals that what he's asking for isn't really respect. It's agreement. And those two things are not the same. Mike sees that difference clearly, and he doesn't let it slide, not because he wants to undermine Archie as a person, but because he refuses to treat authority as something that exists without question. And so the conversation starts to stretch, to deepen, to circle around this unspoken conflict. Gloria feels it immediately because she's caught between them, between the expectation of respecting her father and the reality of engaging with her husband. And her attempts to mediate come from a place of wanting to preserve something, not just the peace of the room, but the relationships within it. And in her quiet way becomes the emotional center, not because she resolves the conflict, but because she changes how it feels. She listens, she responds with kindness. She tries to remind everyone that respect doesn't have to come from fear or silence, that it can exist even in disagreement. But even her presence can't stop the momentum of the argument, because the argument isn't just about the issue anymore. It's about control. It's about who gets to define what's acceptable in that room. And as the episode unfolds, you start to notice how the conversation keeps returning to the same place, even as the words change, even as the examples shift. Because Archie keeps trying to reassert his authority, and Mike keeps refusing to accept it on those terms. And that repetition becomes the structure of the episode. Not a series of events, not a progression toward resolution, but a cycle, a pattern. Archie makes a statement, Mike questions it. Archie doubles down, Mike challenges further, and each cycle feels slightly more charged, slightly more personal, because the underlying issue isn't being addressed directly. No one says, "This is about respect." No one says, "This is about authority." But it's there in every exchange, in every pause, in every moment where the conversation could shift but doesn't. And that's where the show becomes something more than just a comedy, because it's not using the argument as a setup for jokes. It's using the argument as a way to explore something real, something uncomfortable, something that doesn't have an easy answer. Because what does respect actually look like in a situation like this? Is it silence? Is it agreement? Is it the absence of challenge? Or is it something more complicated, something that allows for disagreement without collapsing into conflict? The show doesn't answer that question. It lets it sit there in the space between the characters, in the way they talk to each other, in the way they react, in the way they struggle to connect even as they push against each other. And that was incredibly groundbreaking for its time, because television wasn't built around this kind of sustained tension. It wasn't designed to let characters sit in disagreement without resolving it, without teaching a clear lesson, without guiding the audience toward a specific conclusion. But this show trusted the audience to sit with it, to feel the discomfort, to recognize the patterns, to see the ways in which authority can be mistaken for respect, and how that mistake can create distance instead of connection. The living room setting amplifies all of this because it keeps everything close, contained, inescapable. There's no shift in scenery to break the tension, no external plot to distract from what's happening, just the conversation, unfolding in real time with all its repetition, all its frustration, all its small moments of humor that come not from clever jokes, but from the sheer familiarity of the situation. Because there are moments where you laugh, not because something is traditionally funny, but because it's recognizable, because you've seen this dynamic before, maybe in your own life, maybe in other conversations. That moment where someone insists on being respected without being questioned, and someone else refuses to accept that, and the result is a loop that doesn't resolve. And that's where the humor and the discomfort intertwine. Because the show isn't making fun of the characters, it's showing them, fully, honestly, in all their stubbornness, their vulnerability, their need to be heard, their fear of being dismissed. Archie's insistence on authority comes from somewhere. It's not just arrogance, it's tied to a sense of identity, a way of understanding the world that feels stable and familiar. And the idea of that being challenged doesn't just feel like disagreement, it feels like loss. Mike's resistance comes from his own perspective, his belief in questioning, in challenging, in not accepting things simply because they've always been that way. And that belief doesn't leave room for quiet agreement when something feels wrong. Gloria's emotional responses reflect the strain of living between those two positions, and kindness reflects the possibility of something softer, something more understanding, even if it doesn't fully resolve the conflict. And by the time the episode reaches its final moments, there's no dramatic shift, no sudden realization where Archie changes his mind or Mike decides to step back and agree. There's just a slowing down, a sense that the conversation has reached a point where it can't keep building in the same way. Not because it's resolved, but because it's exhausted. And that exhaustion feels real. It feels earned. Because you've been through the entire cycle with them. You've felt the repetition, the tension, the way the argument keeps returning to the same core issue, even as it tries to move forward. And when it ends, it doesn't feel like an ending. It feels like a pause, like the conversation could start again at any moment, because the underlying issue hasn't been resolved, it's just been set aside for now. And that's what makes it linger, what makes it feel relevant even now, because the idea of mistaking authority for respect, of expecting agreement instead of engagement, of confusing silence with acceptance, that hasn't gone away. If anything, it's still very much part of how people interact, how they argue, how they struggle to understand each other. And watching this episode, you don't just see a snapshot of a specific time. You see something ongoing, something that continues to play out in different forms, in different places, in different conversations. Personally, I find that kind of storytelling incredibly powerful, because it doesn't try to simplify anything. It doesn't try to make the characters more agreeable or the situation more comfortable. It just shows you what happens when people talk from positions that feel fixed, when authority is asserted instead of examined, when respect is demanded instead of built. And sitting with that, letting it unfold slowly, without rushing to a conclusion, without forcing a resolution, you start to appreciate how much the show trusted its audience, how willing it was to let discomfort exist, to let tension define the experience instead of resolving it. And maybe that's why it still feels so alive, so relevant, so worth revisiting, because it doesn't pretend that these dynamics are easy to solve. It just shows them honestly, patiently, and lets you sit with what they mean.